2013 was a pretty landmark year in video games, but no game made a bigger impact in 2013 than The Last of Us. The Last of Us was such a huge critical and commercial success that, given the franchise-obsessed mindset of the video game industry, a sequel was pretty much inevitable. So 7 years later, we finally got a sequel in which the protagonist of the first game was killed off in the game's inciting incident, and about half the game has the player playing as the protagonist's killer, and the game ends with you letting her go. And as you can imagine, players had a completely normal reaction to all of these events. I'm kidding, they lost their shit. So, okay, The Last of Us, which I will hereby be referring to as simply Part 1 to avoid confusion, is my favorite video game of all time. I've replayed it more times than any other video game I've ever played, and it's not even close. So when they first announced that they were making a part 2, I was actually somewhat nervous. The first game had such a perfect, airtight story that I was worried that the sequel wouldn't have any narrative connection to the first game, that they would just invent some arbitrary reason to have Joel and Ellie go back out into the wilderness, although apparently that's what a lot of fans wanted. So I actually really liked the second game. Then again, my reasons for liking the first game so much were more the artistic and thematic elements rather than simply the characters, making it easy for me to let go of Joel, but that's just me. Anyway, I feel as though when people say that the story of Part 2 is bad, it comes less from a place of genuine dislike and more from a place of confusion. What I mean is that in most other bad pieces of media, we can generally see what the author's intentions were, which then makes it easy to pinpoint exactly what went wrong and how it could have been fixed. With The Last of Us Part 2, however, I feel like most people don't even understand why many of the narrative decisions were made in the first place. Why did you kill off Joel, Naughty Dog? Why did you have me play as his killer, Naughty Dog? Why did you make me let her go, Naughty Dog? And because people can't find the answers to these questions, they deem the game as bad. This is why a lot, not all, but a lot of negative criticism lobbed against this game feels like people kind of grasping at straws. They want to hate the game, but they don't even fully understand the thing they're hating in the first place. Well, it's been 4 years, so maybe it's time to shed some light on this whole thing. My goal with this video is less to get you to like The Last of Us Part 2, but rather to get you to at least understand The Last of Us Part 2. My hope is that by the end of this video, you'll understand why Naughty Dog made all the creative decisions that they made, and why many people consider this game to be good and a good sequel to Part 1. You don't have to like the game, but at the very least, you'll understand it. Part 1, Stuff I Hate. Okay, so The Last of Us Part 2 is one of those things that the internet has decided is objectively the worst thing ever, and they will burn you at the stake for saying virtually anything positive about it and claim that you're just a paid shill for Naughty Dog, which, dude, I wish. Do you know how expensive college is? So to show how this game is not beyond criticism and to appease the people who seem to get off on hating this game, here's a list of things I don't like in The Last of Us Part 2. Okay, first is this open world level. Okay, this is part of a larger trend I've been seeing in AAA games for the past several years, where a game developer who has traditionally made linear games will try to make open world titles. Without going into a huge rant, oh my god, I kind of hate it. Anyway, with The Last of Us Part 2, I will admit that the level design here is much better than the level design in the jungle level in Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. In The Lost Legacy, I had to constantly stop and open my map to make sure I was going in the right direction. In The Last of Us Part 2, I forgot I even had a map. It's just that well designed. There are also a lot of moments that I like in this level. The conversation between Ellie and Dina inside the synagogue is nice, and the music store scene is one of the best moments in either game. My biggest problem with this level, however, is just how unnecessary it all feels. There isn't anything that pushes the story forward in this level. The most we get is some moments of character development between Ellie and Dina in the synagogue and the music store, both moments that could have been added to the linear portion of the game. There's actually a level in part 1 that this reminds me of, and that's the moment when you first enter Lincoln. Here you enter a small town, and for a brief period of time, the game becomes a small open world where you can explore different stores, discovering secrets, and having small character moments before continuing on with the story.
Man, this is kind of sad.
What is?
All this music that's just sitting here. No one's around to listen to it.
There's two major differences between the two levels, however. First is their length. This level in part 1 will take you at most 10 minutes to get through if you want to see everything, and about 5 seconds if you want to just skip through it and continue with the story. This level in part 2 will take you at minimum 10 minutes, and that's if you go straight for the gas, know exactly what you're doing, and have cheats enabled. The whole level will take you about an hour to get through if you want to see everything, which, again, aside from a few small character moments, doesn't really add anything to the narrative. The second is that this level in part 1 is optional, whereas the level in part 2 is not. The required elements in the level in part 2 have nothing to do with the plot. It's just a forced side quest to get gas. Ultimately, the level just kind of feels like a giant waste of time and just feels like Naughty Dog showing off. It takes way too long to get through and adds very little to the overall narrative. The lost levels are way shorter and honestly add way more depth to the story. Okay, so the next thing I don't really care for is Jesse. He feels horribly underdeveloped as a character. His whole personality is basically just patrols and Dina's ex. He's just not that very developed, so when he dies, it's just like, I don't really care. So next is this awkward transition between Ellie and Abby's storylines. Essentially, the main problem is the way that the game is structured. Overall, I don't have a problem with what the game is doing. I actually really like this, but it does create a big pacing problem right here. See, what Naughty Dog basically did is that they made a 10-hour Abby DLC and just stuck it right in the middle of the main game. So this scene basically goes from the end of Act 2 in Ellie's storyline to the beginning of Act 1 in a completely different story. And that pacing is kind of awkward. There's a similar problem when jumping between Abby's storyline and back into Ellie's storyline, where we're going from basically the end of Act 3 in Abby's storyline back to the end of Act 2 in Ellie's. To be fair, I'm not really sure how you would fix this without completely ruining what the game is trying to do, but the pacing issue is still a problem. Okay, then is probably the thing I hate most in part 2, which is Marlene. I get why Marlene is here. They wanted to re-emphasize the moral dilemma at the end of the first game, and hey, they got Moral Dandridge back, and they're gonna use her, damn it. The problem is that this scene makes absolutely no sense. People act like Joel is out of character just for saying his name, or that Ellie is out of character for rightfully getting pissed at Joel for lying to her. But Marlene is the one character returning from the first game who's actually out of character. In the first game, she literally could not be more excited about getting a vaccine.
Once they remove it, they'll be able to reverse engineer a vaccine. A vaccine.
But in part 2, it turns out she actually had a lot of reservations about killing Ellie for a vaccine.
I'm aware of the situation.
And you're okay with killing her?
The commentary tried to justify this by being like, oh, you thought Marlene was evil, but she actually didn't want to make a vaccine either. And it's like, that's fine, but the problem is that does not fit with the character that they wrote in part 1. I do not buy that a character who said this,
If this was your daughter, what would you do?
would 5 minutes later be saying this.
Because this isn't about me, or even her. There is no other choice here.
And these scenes literally happen right after each other. What, did she have like a character arc walking down that hallway? And the thing is, if they really wanted to have this conflict in the scene, it wouldn't have been that hard to fix this. Literally, just have Marlene be the one pushing for the vaccine and have Jerry be the one pushing against it. Not only would this make more sense for Marlene's character, but it also would make way more sense for Jerry. It just kind of baffles me how much this scene just makes absolutely no sense from every angle. Okay, most of Abby's section I actually don't have much of a problem with until Act 3 with the whole trip to Scar Island thing. I get why they included it. You can't just like set up Scar Island and not go to Scar Island. Plus, they need a reason for Abby not to be at the aquarium when Ellie shows up, and Abby definitely needed this culminating moment in her character arc where she finally chooses Lev over the wolves. My problem is the reason for going to Scar Island is kind of weak. It's just that Lev wants to go get his mom to come with them to Santa Barbara, which is fine, I guess, but there's virtually no setup for this. We don't even learn about Lev's mom until basically 5 minutes before this happens. The thing is that it wouldn't have been that hard to set this up. The whole point of Act 2 in Abby's storyline is her bonding with Lev, and they could include like one conversation between the two where Lev mentions like how much he likes his mom or something. Then when Lev goes to rescue his mom in the beginning of Act 3, it would be like, ah, right, he likes his mom. That makes sense. Instead of how it is in the final game where we don't learn about his mom until right before it happens. And so it's just like, what the hell, Lev? And also, while we're here, that's not where the Space Needle is. The Space Needle is further inland. It wouldn't be that far from downtown. Also, did like Seattle flood uphill? You know, whatever. I don't really care. Also, Yara dying, I'm not a big fan of. I get why they did it. The main bond was between Abby and Lev, and it would have been kind of awkward to have Abby carrying both Lev and Yara in the final section of the game. Also, apparently Lev was supposed to die here originally instead of Yara, which they changed. Good call that. But it's also like the diegetic point of Act 2 in Abby's storyline was literally getting medical supplies to save Yara's life, and then Yara just dies anyway. I get the real point of Act 2 was Abby bonding with Lev and giving Abby a redemption arc, which the game is very good at. And I get why they killed Yara off. They needed her out of the plot. Fine. It just feels kind of weak. And then there's this boss fight between Ellie and Abby. And look, I can explain most of the decisions Naughty Dog made throughout the game, but even this one I'm kind of at a loss for. I'm not really sure what the decision was to play as Abby here, because there's this awkward dissonance where Abby wants to kill Ellie, but, I don't. Like, no, I don't want to press square to kill Ellie. To be fair, Naughty Dog kind of painted themselves into a corner with this scene, since the whole point of Abby's storyline was getting you to sympathize with her. So even if you were playing as Ellie, there would still be some dissonance here. However, I think there would have been less dissonance playing as Ellie rather than as Abby. And finally, I'm not crazy about the Rattlers. Like, I think their lore is cool and everything, but the problem is that they're in the game for so little. I don't think you should create all this cool lore for a faction that's only going to show up for, half a chapter. In comparison, the Hunter group in Pittsburgh in the first game don't really have any lore besides the truck, and Pittsburgh is the longest chapter in the game, and yet it still totally works. And I think that would have been the better way to go with the Rattlers. And yeah, that's about it for the stuff I hate. So, part 2, bad faith criticisms. So like I said earlier, when people try to explain why this game is objectively terrible, a lot of it feels like people kind of grasping at straws. I'm not saying that all criticism is valid. After all, I literally just spent like 10 minutes describing everything I hate in this game. However, there is some criticism that I feel like is unearned or actually has pretty obvious explanations if you bother to think about it for more than 5 seconds. because a lot of people use these criticisms as roadblocks for saying anything good about the game, I'm going to spend some time, and by some time I mean most of this video, addressing them. So if you don't care about any of that and just want an explanation of what the game is doing, skip over to this timestamp. Okay, first let's get the big one out of the way. Joel dying is bad. So the main argument that started popping up regarding this even before the game released is that Joel shouldn't be killed off because he's a beloved character who the fans love. Which, like, okay, I get that you guys like Joel, but I don't think we should be dousing him with thousands of pounds of plot armor just because the fans like him. The reasons you should kill off a character or keep a character alive should come from the needs of the story, not whether or not the audience likes the character. Demands that mediums such as movies, television, and video games should prioritize giving the fans what they want is something unique to genre fiction. Genre fiction, that is science fiction, fantasy, and action-adventure, which The Last of Us falls into, has a tendency to garner fan bases, whereas genres such as traditional drama don't. Compare the likes of Marvel and DC to, say, the Before trilogy or the Souvenir duology. Both films that are technically franchises since they have multiple installments, though don't garner nearly the same amount of fans as franchises in genre fiction like Marvel or Star Wars. So then becomes a problem of, what if you're an artist who wants to write a story that happens to be in genre fiction? Sure, having fans is nice, but there also comes a point where you kind of have to accept that for some writers, telling the story that they want to tell is a higher priority than pleasing their fans. And it's highly unlikely that they're going to sacrifice telling the story that they want to tell just to please fans that they might have not even asked for in the first place. Then there's this argument that killing off Joel isn't bad, but just the way they killed off Joel is bad. See, Joel is a beloved character, so he should have died at the end of the game peacefully in Ellie's arms because that's the only way you can kill off a beloved character, I guess. I keep seeing these really dumb fanfic comments of Joel dying what is essentially the Arthur Morgan death, and all I can say is thank God that Naughty Dog didn't do this. These death scenes are some of the most cliched tropes in writing, and I hate them. No, I don't think that the game would have been better with Joel dying like this. Hell, across both games, the closest we ever get to a death scene like this is Sarah in Part 1, which even that is a bit of subversion of this trope, with neither character really getting a chance to say anything before she dies. Look, love or hate Neil Druckmann, it's pretty obvious that he hates cliche and generic storytelling, so I'm really glad they didn't go with this route. Then I've heard it argued that Naughty Dog wants us to think that Joel is a monster for saving Ellie in the first game and deserved to die like this. Which, like, no, that's not what the game is doing at all. See, the first game is Joel's story. He's the one who grows and changes and develops without a narrative. So the first game is told through his perspective. And through his perspective, he did the right thing. The thing is that by the end of the first game, Joel's character arc is complete. In the second game, Ellie is the protagonist. She is the one who needs to grow and change and develop. The game is told through her perspective, and from her perspective, Joel did the wrong thing. Just because a story wants you to see through the perspective of a certain character does not mean that the story wants you to agree with that character, just that they want you to understand how that character feels. I've also heard it argued that if you analyze every piece of data and evidence and go full, MatPat game theory, that you can determine that the Fireflies would have never been able to realistically develop a vaccine from Ellie's infection, and that therefore Joel objectively did the right thing. Okay, first of all, while it's fun to analyze what would actually happen, this kind of ruins the point of the end of the first game. The whole point of the ending is to provide the player with a moral dilemma. Would you sacrifice someone that you loved to save everyone else? And here's the thing about moral dilemmas. There's not supposed to be a right or wrong answer. That's why they're moral dilemmas. And if you want to determine that saving Ellie would have been the objectively right decision by overanalyzing every tiny little detail in the first game, fine. But you can't use that to argue that Joel made the objectively right decision for one simple reason. Joel didn't know any of that information when he made his decision to save Ellie. All that he knew was what Marlene told him, which is that the Fireflies could develop a vaccine and it would kill Ellie. So if you want to argue that he made the objectively right decision, fine. But what Marlene tells him is all you get to go off of, because that's all that Joel knows when he decides to save Ellie. Then I've heard argued that no, actually, Ellie wouldn't have thought Joel did the wrong thing. The worst of these takes comes from the critical drinker in his video, Joel Did Nothing Wrong, The Importance of Ambiguity, where he argues,
what makes the ending of this game even more interesting is the subtle implication that Ellie kind of knows she's being lied to. I mean, look at her facial expression here. Does this really look like someone who totally believes what she just heard? But just like Joel, she's prepared to play along with the lie to spare him further pain. In other words, she too is willing to do and accept something morally wrong because she loves him just as much as he loves her.
So, Joel lied to Ellie to alleviate Ellie from the guilt of knowing that he killed a bunch of random Firefly soldiers, and Ellie knows he's lying somehow, and also knows that the reason he's lying is to alleviate her from the guilt of knowing that he killed a bunch of rando Firefly soldiers somehow, and that's why she's okay with it. I'm sorry, but does anyone else find this explanation kind of convoluted? So, okay, with media analysis, technically you can argue any interpretation of a text. However, you need to back up that interpretation with strong evidence from the text, otherwise it's just bad analysis. And the only evidence Drinker provides here is that Ellie made a sad face. Like, Drinker, you know she was just talking about her dead best friend like 5 seconds before this. You don't think she could be sad about that?
My best friend was there. And she got bit too.
I've played through this game like at least 30 times, including several times after watching this video, and I'm sorry, but I've never found any evidence leading to this interpretation. How does Ellie makes a sad face tell us any of this? That is way too vague and can mean almost anything. And look, I don't know Drinker personally, I can't get inside his head and know what he's thinking. Maybe he genuinely interpreted this ending when he first played the game in 2013. But given how little sense this interpretation makes, and how quickly he uses this interpretation to bash on the second game,
which makes it even more of a fucking ball ache that the sequel completely retcons Joel's choices, changing them from the desperate actions of a loving father into those of a selfish, bloodthirsty psychopath who deserves to be mercilessly punished for what he did. And to complete the betrayal, Ellie's tacit acceptance of what Joel had been forced to do was completely ignored so they could have a ridiculous and contrived argument, and she could berate him for the crime of protecting someone he loves.
I can't help but feel that he reverse engineered this interpretation from a place of wanting to hate the second game. I don't like this plot point in part 2, so I'm going to analyze the ending of part 1 that makes part 2 look bad. Isn't part 2 bad? Again, I could be totally wrong, but also, Drinker, if the sequel contradicts your interpretation of the ending of the first game, maybe it's not the developers. Maybe you just got your interpretation wrong. Okay, if you're so smart, then what does the ending of part 1 mean? Well, I'm glad you asked, Internet Strawman. And I'm not just explaining the ending of the first game to explain why this plot point in part 2 does make sense actually, but also because understanding the ending of part 1 is key to understanding the entirety of part 2. So, okay. Earlier in the game, just before Joel and Ellie get to the Fireflies, Joel suggests ditching the mission and going back to Tommy's, to which Ellie responds with this.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
So, okay, what does that mean? What Ellie's basically saying is that the two of them have been through so much hardship and lost so much just to get to the Fireflies. If they turn back now, then the journey and all that hardship would have been for nothing. But if they continue and get a cure for the cordyceps, then all that hardship and loss would have been worth it. This is something that's echoed by Marlene later on.
It's what she'd want. And you know it.
And the thing is that Joel does know this. It's literally what Ellie told him earlier. And this is why Joel lies to her. He knows if he tells her the truth, that there could have been a cure for the virus, but he stopped it, that she would have felt that all that hardship would have been for nothing. At least with this lie, he can say that even though they didn't get a cure, they did everything that they could to get one, so it wasn't technically worthless. This is also why Ellie makes Joel swear to her that he's telling the truth, and why she has that survivor's guilt just before.
Her name was Riley, and she was the first to die. And then it was Tess. And then Sam.
Yeah, that monologue Ellie gives about Riley, that wasn't just a pretty little monologue Naughty Dog just threw in. It actually has meaning to the scene. Here, Ellie is expressing all the loss that she experienced to get to the Fireflies. She knows that if Joel is telling the truth, and that they did everything they could to get a cure and the Fireflies just gave up, then she could live with herself from losing Riley and Tess and Sam, and that they technically didn't die for nothing. But if Joel is lying, and there could have been a cure, but they didn't take it, then in Ellie's eyes, the deaths of Riley, Tess, and Sam were for nothing. See, a lot of Ending Explained videos and articles on Part 1 pretty much begin and end with, does Ellie believe Joel? But I think that's missing the point. The point is that Ellie feels that she needs to believe Joel, as that's the only way she can live with herself. I think she's not sure if Joel is telling the truth, but since he swears that he is, she chooses to believe him, as that's the only way she can live with herself. And so you see how all of this is built off of actual evidence and lines of dialogue from the game and not just on a look that a character gives? And you see how there's so much more emotional resonance with this ending? And while I think you should gather your interpretation of a story's ending from evidence of that story alone, the fact that this interpretation does not contradict what happens in Part 2 definitely helps. With this interpretation in mind, it makes sense that Ellie would react this way to learning the truth. Right here is all that guilt about Riley, Tess, and Sam coming back to her. And so keep this whole interpretation of Part 1 in mind because, like I said, it's crucial to understanding Part 2. Okay, so back to Joel's death. Then there's this crowd that decided that Joel is out of character because he told Abby's group his name. The argument is that Joel from the first game would have never done this. He's a badass, remember?
Put your seatbelt on, Ellie.
Well, what about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
This scene is the most common scene referenced in the Joel from the first game wouldn't do this argument, to which I argue, yes, that Joel would not have done this. That's because Joel in the first game went through what's called a character arc. See, Joel's whole character arc in Part 1 is basically him learning to be more loving and caring about others, specifically Ellie. You could honestly use this same argument for the first game alone. Joel risking his life to save Ellie? The Joel from the beginning of the game wouldn't have done that. What happened, Naughty Dog? The Joel at the end of the game is different than the Joel at the beginning of the game. The problem with using this scene as your argument is that the Joel in this scene isn't complete with his character arc yet. So if you want to argue that Joel from the first game would not have done this, fine. But you have to argue that Joel from this point in the story wouldn't have done that, not this point. There's also the fact that by this scene, Abby already knew that this was Joel. If you actually bother to play the game, you'll know that Tommy is the first person to tell Abby Joel's name.
Hey, I'm Tommy. That's Joel.
Not only is this consistent with Tommy's character from the first game, who was established as being more trustworthy, but the whole point of him telling Abby their names was literally to build trust between them in what was an extremely dangerous situation. And it would have been kind of suspicious if Joel just suddenly gave them a different name 5 minutes later. So if you want to blame someone for this, blame Tommy, not Joel. We'll talk more about the supposed logic problems of this scene in a bit. Okay, so then there's criticisms about Abby, specifically her muscular physique. So originally I was just going to include a section on Abby's design specifically and explain why she's designed like this. But then, bad character designs in video games had to get all topical this year, because, Gamergate 2, Electric Boogaloo. So, this is a conversation we need to have now. Don't you just love the internet? So the argument being posed by some people is that game developers are purposely making video game characters look ugly, and these characters are so ugly that they are single-handedly being responsible for helping destroy the entire gaming industry. What are these horrid abominations that are so awful to look at that they could destroy an entire industry? Well, these are the characters. Yeah, not exactly the ugliest characters in existence. The argument being posed is basically video games are escapist entertainment, and with animation, we can make anything we want, so why not have all the women be as sexy as possible all the time? So, there's some very clear underlying sexism and transphobia going on in these arguments. First of all, I don't think it's surprising that virtually the only characters being criticized for being ugly are women, despite the fact that for the past several years, we've had plenty of male characters who are not all traditionally handsome, yet no one is calling, for example, Micah from Red Dead Redemption 2 ugly. There's also the fact that virtually the only counterexample to these ugly characters is Eve from Stellar Blade, a character who is very overtly sexualized. I'm not saying you can't have a sexy protagonist, but I think it's pretty telling that the only counterexample people can think of to ugly characters in gaming is an overly sexualized protagonist and not the countless other female character designs that we've had in the past few decades. There's also the Twitter account Game Characters AI, which uses AI to quote-unquote fix video game characters by literally just making them more sexualized. Which, okay, can I just say that this outfit makes absolutely no sense? So, I grew up in Seattle area, so I know how cold and wet it gets here, especially in the winter, springtime. You would never wear something like this. You would freeze. Also, more skin showing means more likely that you're going to get scratched or bit if you run into infected. This outfit just makes no sense. It's also not surprising that virtually the only features being described as ugly on female characters are physical traits traditionally associated with men, essentially saying that any woman who has these traits are ugly. The underlying message being trans women are ugly. Of course, they don't actually say that, but the groundwork is already there. I won't go into too much detail about some of these arguments. Grey Wolf already made a great video breaking this down. Unfortunately, by the time of recording this, he had unlisted it, but I will still link it in the description. But what I want to break down is that original argument. Video games are escapist entertainment, and with animation, we can make anything we want, so let's have all the women be as sexy as possible. But wait, aren't video games supposed to be art? See, I want to propose a different philosophy to designing characters. Wouldn't it be better to design characters whose physical appearance matched the personality of the character and represented their role within the narrative, rather than just look pretty? For example, take a look at Overwatch. This is a game that Blizzard put endless amounts of efforts into designing their characters. The only problem is that Overwatch is a multiplayer game with no story. Yes, there is lore and technically a story going on, but most of that is told through like short films and media made outside the source material. The game itself doesn't really have a story. So you spent all this time designing these great characters for a game with literally no plot. What do? Well, essentially, Blizzard put all their effort into the physical designs of the characters to make sure that they perfectly encapsulated the characters' personalities. And they nailed it. Overwatch has some of the best character designs in any media ever. Everything about their appearance, their clothing, their mannerisms tells you everything about who the character is. Now take a look at this controversy from the first release of Overwatch. Basically, this pose from the character Tracer was controversial for being too sexual. Oh, so we can't have sexy character poses now? Well, no, that's not the point. Compare that to this pose from the character Widowmaker. A similar pose that's also kind of sexualized, only this time it didn't generate any controversy. Why? Well, Widowmaker's personality is supposed to be that of like a badass loner female sniper, similar to that of Black Widow from Marvel. This pose kind of reflects that. Tracer, however, is supposed to have a more cheerful, happy-go-lucky personality. It doesn't make sense for a character like that to be sexualized. The controversy wasn't that sexy characters are bad, it's that a character was being sexualized where it didn't fit the character. The point is that, yes, video games are animated, so why not take advantage of that and create character designs that perfectly reflect who that character is and what their role is in the narrative? Which finally brings us back to Abby. So lots of people seem to assume that Abby has a muscular physique because of something woke SJW feminism, I guess. There's also YouTuber Never Knows Best who, to avoid going on an hour-long tangent because his critique of The Last of Us 2 is quite bad, claims that
why Naughty Dog decided to design her this way is something I really don't know. A lot of people seem to be equating this design with something political, but if that's the case, I'm not sure I even follow the logic. Honestly, when I played this game, I wondered if the reason Abby was designed this way was just because someone important on the development team just had a big muscle girl fetish.
And it's like, okay, your whole platform on YouTube is to smartly critique video games, and the only thing you can think of is that someone on the team had a muscle girl fetish. Like, you can't think of anything else, really? So, okay, why does Abby have the muscles? First of all, let's get what I think is the most obvious answer out of the way. She's living in the middle of a giant zombie apocalypse where every single day she has to fight for survival, and you don't think in that situation someone might prioritize brute strength over traditional beauty? So, aside from the obvious, there's also an explicit narrative reason as to why Abby is designed like this. The game actually tells us, though it is through subtext, so it might be hard to spot. Let's see if you can find it.
Abby.
No!
Abby, don't look.
Dad! Dad! No! No! Joel, get up.
Did you catch it? Here, let me play it for you again.
Joel, get up.
Still didn't catch it? Well, okay. Abby got muscular in preparation for getting revenge against Joel, which, honestly, that makes sense, right? Think about it. The only thing she knew about Joel is that he was able to single-handedly take down an entire hospital full of armed Firefly soldiers. You would probably want to prepare for something like that too. But there's also a third explanation for Abby's physique, and that's the emotional impression that she makes on the player. See, Abby is someone who is supposed to be intimidating to look at, and I mean, yeah, that's pretty intimidating. I wouldn't want to mess with her. This comes into sharper focus when you consider the fact that Abby doesn't have muscles throughout the entire game. Both in the 4 years ago flashback and in the third act of the game, Abby doesn't have those sweet muscles and is instead small and scrawny. This is where the SJW feminism and muscle girl fetish arguments completely fall apart. If the only and main reason as to why they gave Abby muscles was because of feminism and muscle girl fetishes, why not keep her muscular physique throughout the entire game? Well, we already covered why the flashback doesn't have her muscular. As for the climax, well, the purpose is the impression her physique makes on the player. Again, throughout most of the game, Abby is supposed to look intimidating, but in the climax, she's supposed to look weak and helpless. And what better way to make your muscular character look weak and helpless than to take away the one thing that kept her from looking weak? The subtext of the scene is that Abby no longer wants anything to do with her former life. She wants nothing to do with the wolves or Ellie or anything. She just wants to move on. Here, she's supposed to be the weak and helpless one, and Ellie, confronting Abby about her past, is supposed to be the intimidating one. Abby essentially atones for her sins in this scene, first by literally being crucified, and then 5 minutes later being metaphorically baptized when Ellie tries to drown her. And I know some people might think I'm reading too much into it by calling this a metaphorical baptism, but considering the pretty on-the-nose religious imagery we saw literally right before this scene, I don't think it's too much of a stretch. It's also worth noting that her physique does get remarked upon in the text.
He told me about a woman that he traded with while he was moving through California. Described her as built like an ox.
We picked one up a couple months ago.
Yeah, sure.
No, big girl. Blonde. Arms like mine.
Giving her a muscular physique gives her a unique physical trait so that in these scenes, Ellie, and by extent us, know for a fact that they're talking about Abby. So when you take all this into account, the world building, the narrative, the impression she makes on the player, the real question isn't why would you design Abby like this? It's why wouldn't you design Abby like this? There's also a fourth thematic reason as to why Abby has a muscular physique, which we'll touch on later. And to those people who say that it's impossible for women to look like this, I say that to Colleen Faust. Who's Colleen Faust? Oh, just the person they based Abby's physique off of. Yeah, go tell her that women who look like her can't exist in real life and just see how well that goes for you. If you want to argue that it would be impossible for Abby to go from this to this in just 4 years, fine, argue that, but don't say it's impossible, period. Okay, so then let's address my least favorite type of narrative criticism, plot holes. So I've always seen plot holes as essentially like the low-hanging fruit of narrative criticism. It's easy to find, it's easy to complain about, it's easy to make the story look bad, but it doesn't require any knowledge of stuff like narrative structure, character arcs, themes, technical techniques unique to the medium, and how they're used to tell the story, etc. All you have to do is point out how something that happened in a story couldn't happen in real life, and then treat it like you outsmarted the author. It's not necessarily bad in and of itself, but if that's all you got, then in my opinion, it's pretty lazy. One of my biggest problems with plot hole criticisms is that oftentimes people get so excited to find a supposed plot hole that they don't check to see if there's an explanation in the text that might explain the plot hole. This is often the case with plot holes that people try to point out in The Last of Us Part 2, with often obvious answers to the supposed plot holes in the subtext and sometimes just straight up in the text. Which to me reads that people are pointing out plot holes not as legitimate criticism, but because they're so excited to hate on the game that they don't check to see if their criticism holds any weight to begin with. Now, I won't be going over every plot hole. After all, plot holes are inevitable in narrative fiction, especially genre fiction, but I will be addressing some of the main ones I see come up most often that I think are just wrong. Why did Joel and Tommy trust Abby and follow her to her hideout? Because they were being chased by literally hundreds of infected through a raging blizzard. Their options were literally go out and survive in a blizzard with dozens of infected, or trust that these people aren't going to kill them. If you were in that situation, why do Joel and Tommy tell Abby's group their names? Because these are a group of strangers who, remember, are kind of forced to be stuck with each other for a while because of the raging blizzard and infected outside. They kind of have no choice but to be with each other, and giving each other their names is a sign of trust between them. Keep in mind that Mel also gave her name before Joel gave his.
I'm Mel, by the way.
Tommy. This is my brother.
Joe.
Also keep in mind that the only reason they attacked Joel and Tommy is specifically because they happened to run into Joel and Tommy. If they had ran into, for example, Ellie and Dina instead, the situation would not have gotten violent. They just would have waited out the storm together and traveled down to Jackson. Why didn't Abby's group kill Ellie and Tommy after killing Joel? So this one's actually directly addressed in the dialogue if you actually play the game. See, the first time we see Abby kill Joel, the audio cuts out since we see it from Ellie's perspective. But the second time we see it from Abby's perspective. And pay attention to the dialogue.
Whoa, what are you doing? Manny.
Cleaning up.
No. We're here for him. That's it.
It's too risky to leave them alive.
Too fucking bad.
He's right. We can't have loose ends.
We killed them. We're no better than he was. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, look at my face.
Fuck your face. You should have been guarding the upstairs like I told you to. Move! Back up.
Calm down.
Or what? Back the fuck up!
Calm down!
Darden! You gonna shoot me?
Stop! We're done.
And remember, they don't really have time to argue about this. They don't know who Ellie is. For all they know, she's just some girl from the town that showed up looking for Joel. And if she's there, then the rest of the town might not be that far behind. Then there's arguments that this whole situation is quote-unquote contrived, which, I mean, yeah. I mean, every story is contrived to an extent. Hell, the break into two moment in part 1 is way more contrived than this. You're telling me that the Fireflies just happened to be shot dead, and that Tess just happened to be bit, and the Federal soldiers just happened to show up all right now? All of this is contrived to get Joel and Ellie by themselves. And honestly, most of this makes sense. Joel and Tommy are on patrol in the winter. It makes sense that they would run into infected and a blizzard. Abby's out here looking for Joel. It makes sense that she might happen to run into them. Okay, so then there's some people mad at the marketing for the game for being misleading, which, okay, yeah, I get, but also you kind of have to take into account that The Last of Us Part 2 is a difficult game to market, even in the best of circumstances. Here you have the sequel to one of the most popular and acclaimed video games of all time, and the game's inciting incident is also the game's biggest spoiler. How the hell do you even begin to market that? I know some people are pissed that they made this fake footage of Joel in the trailer, which, like, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of, but I get why they did it. It would have been pretty suspicious if Joel was hardly in the trailer for The Last of Us 2. And also, it's not, like, unheard of for people to create fake footage for trailers to avoid spoilers. Take Succession Season 4, for example. Here we have a popular and acclaimed series on its final season, where the season's inciting incident is also the season's biggest spoiler, which also just so happens to be the unexpected death of a major character. So for the trailer HBO released, they created fake footage to throw people off the scent that Logan wasn't going to be in the final season very much and that he was going to die. So I don't think it's fair to get mad at Naughty Dog if you didn't get mad at HBO for doing literally the exact same thing. Then there's also this moment in an interview where they stated that Ellie would be the only playable character, and that was a lie. And I'm just like, did you guys want the whole game spoiled for you? Look, they obviously consider the fact that the second half of Act 2 being played from Abby's perspective is a massive spoiler, which, yeah, I would consider that a spoiler as well. So here you have a seemingly perfectly innocent question where to answer honestly would mean spoiling your entire story. So you can either tell the truth and spoil your story for the entire audience, or lie and preserve the intended experience of the story. Here's the thing. Most writers, if put in this position, would probably choose the latter. Writers hate having their story spoiled for their audience, and honestly, I respect that. I think accusing Naughty Dog of false advertising in these instances is too much focusing on video games as a commercial commodity rather than an art. Part 3, other nitpicky stuff. So here's just a bunch of random nitpicky stuff people have said about the game that I think is honestly just kind of dumb, but I don't want to spend too much time on. People say that this moment when Maria tells Ellie and Abby to go is contrived, and why didn't she send a large group of people out instead of a grieving Ellie? Which that I say, yeah, it is contrived. To be fair, there is an explanation in the text. Joel is dead, Tommy is gone. She knows that Ellie and Dina are going to leave no matter what she does. And now, with all that, she's down 4 patrolmen, and she probably feels that she can't afford to lose any more, so she sends Ellie and Dina to Seattle to get Tommy. If you want to argue that this doesn't make much logical sense, I don't know, fine. But honestly, this is one of those contrivances just to get the story going. Ellie needs to go to Seattle, and it would have been kind of awkward to have a giant group of people traveling with the player. Maybe it bothers some people, but there is a sort of explanation in the text, and we need Ellie to be relatively alone in Seattle for the story and themes, so, I'm okay with it. People say the game is manipulative, and I'm like, yeah, all art is manipulation. Horror movies are manipulating you to be scared, thrillers are manipulating you to be tense, etc. People specifically point out, like NPCs sometimes screaming when you kill them, and the moment where they make you kill Nora as being bad examples of trying to get you to question the violence, which I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't really get this at all. Character horrifically screaming as you kill them, yeah, that's a pretty good way to get me to question what I'm doing. And as for the Nora scene, well, the whole point of this is to be a turning point for the player. Essentially, when you first go to Seattle, you, the player, are supposed to be like, yeah, let's get some revenge. I can't wait to kill Abby's friends. Then you get to this scene and the game is like, you wanted to kill Abby's friends? Well, here you go. Wait, what's wrong? Isn't this what you wanted? So the fact that it's disturbing for us to actually perform the action is kind of the point. I kind of get the impression that people criticize Naughty Dog trying to get us to question the violence, not because they did a poor job of it, but simply because they tried to do it in the first place. Which, look, if you don't want your games to question the violence, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the case, then why are you playing The Last of Us? There's also people that think the introduction to WLF from Abby's perspective is laughable because they're normal people. Like, you realize Jackson is introduced in the exact same way, right? What, did you think the WLF were these super evil mustache-twirling villains or something? There's a similar criticism as before where people think the game tried to force us to like Abby, which, no, the game does a pretty good job of making Abby relatable, from giving her an emotional backstory, fears, friends, a sense of humor.
What's going on between you and your friend Owen?
Oh my god, Lev, now?
It seemed really awkward.
Just go!
Again, the criticism is less that Naughty Dog did a bad job of making Abby likable, and more that they tried to do so in the first place. Which, look, if you don't want complex 3-dimensional villains in your stories, again, that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But again, why are you playing The Last of Us? There's also some criticism that some other characters in Abby's section are underdeveloped, which, yeah, I kind of get. Owen, Mel, Yara, Nora, they're not the most interesting characters, but also they're not in the story that much. And I feel like while they're not fully developed, they're developed just enough to the point where I can buy that these are real people. Which for characters who aren't in the story a lot is kind of all I need. Some people think this scene is eye-rolling, and it's like, no, introduce your character doing something universally seen as good so we know that they're a good person. That's a pretty common screenwriting trope. There's literally an entire screenwriting book named after this trope. This is fine, guys. I could go on addressing every tiny little criticism lobbed against this game, but we'd be here all day, and this video is already 20 hours long, so let's just jump to the reason why some of y'all are here. Part 4, The Point of The Last of Us Part 2. So remember like way back when I explained the ending of Part 1? For anyone who skipped over this part of the video, I essentially said that Ellie faced so much loss and hardship on the way to the Fireflies that she needed to get something out of it in order for it to be worth it in her mind. So accepting Joel's lie is the only way she can live with herself. She's not 100% sure if Joel is telling the truth or if he's lying, but decides to trust that he's telling the truth as it's the only way she can live with everything that's happened. So remember that. That's pretty important. Okay, so let's talk about clone characters. So quick disclaimer, I'm not actually sure what the official term for this narrative trope is, but I did once have a screenwriting professor use the term clone characters to describe it, so that's just what I'm going to go with. So in creative fiction, a clone character is a character whose main function is to represent and be a reflection of another character. That might sound kind of confusing, so let's use some examples from movies you've probably seen. In Get Out, the character of Andre Hayworth / Logan King, played by Lakeith Stanfield, is a clone character of the protagonist Chris Washington. He serves as a warning as to what will happen to Chris if he doesn't get out.
Get out. Sorry, man.
Okay.
Get out!
In Home Alone, the old neighbor is a clone character of Kevin. Throughout the film, we see that Kevin has a bit of a strained relationship with his family, and the old man is someone who has such a strained relationship with his family that he hasn't spoken to them in years. This is a warning of who Kevin will become if he doesn't improve his relationship with his family, and the thematic reason as to why Kevin is so scared of him throughout the film. The reason why I'm going on about clone characters is because Neil Druckmann uses them all over his writing. They're used in both Part 1 and in Part 2. In Part 1, pretty much everyone Joel and Ellie meet along their journey is a reflection of their relationship, and a warning as to what will happen if Joel doesn't improve his relationship with Ellie. Take, for example, Bill. So at this point in the story, Joel is essentially only taking care of Ellie out of obligation and doesn't really want to be doing this. Then we meet Bill, a lonely, bitter, paranoid guy who we learn.
Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. A partner. Somebody I had to look after. And in this world, that sort of shit's good for one thing. Getting you killed. So you know what I did? I wisened the fuck up. And I realized it's gotta be just me.
Hey, that kind of sounds like how Joel is treating Ellie. And later on, we learn.
What, you know this guy or something?
Frank.
Who the hell's Frank?
He was my partner.
This is what will happen to Joel if he doesn't improve his relationship with Ellie. It's no surprise that the very next scene after this is the first time we see the two of them bonding. The encounters that Joel and Ellie have in the first game are not random filler used to pad the game's length. They're all crucial elements to Joel's character arc. And I emphasize all this because Abby is a clone character. This, by the way, is what some people mean when they say Ellie and Abby are two sides of the same coin. What they're really saying is that Abby is a clone character of Ellie. And I won't refute that. There's definitely a lot to go off of with that interpretation, and I won't go into too much detail because a lot of people have already written a lot about that. But I want to put forth a different interpretation that I see much less often. See, I argue that Abby is a clone character not of Ellie, but of Joel. First of all, both of Joel and Abby's stories are remarkably similar. In both of their stories, they lose a beloved family member in their respective prologues, which leaves them years later being cold and cynical. Until one day when they're tasked with looking after someone who is much younger and more defenseless than they are. Through this journey, they form a strong bond with this character and eventually grow into better people, eventually even risking everything to save their lives. This is why Abby's section of the game is structured the way it is. It's basically the same story. But the similarities don't just end with the narrative. Remember when I said there was a thematic reason for Abby's muscular design? Well, this is it. Because Abby is more muscular, she plays a lot more like Joel than Ellie. Both Abby and Joel use hand-to-hand melee combat, both strangle NPCs during stealth, both have to craft shivs for clickers, whereas in all these instances, Ellie simply just uses her switchblade. Hell, don't believe me? Believe the developers.
I love that at her core, Abby is a protector.
Mm-hmm.
She's Joel.
She's Joel.
Yeah.
So okay, keep this in mind that Abby is a clone character of Joel. One other thing to establish real quick is the game's structure. The game is purposely structured so that by the end of Act 1, you, the player, want revenge. Then in the first half of Act 2, you begin to question whether it's actually worth it. Then in the second half of Act 2, learn Abby's perspective and understand why she did what she did, so that when you come back around, you've come full circle. That's also important. Now, okay, what are the two main storylines of the game? And for this, I'm counting Abby's storyline as part of Ellie's. Well, the two main storylines of the game are the present-day storyline with Ellie trying to get revenge against Abby and everything in Seattle, and 2, the flashbacks of Ellie learning the truth about what Joel did and her being angry at Joel. Now, you have to ask, why would they purposely juxtapose these two storylines together? What do they have to do with each other? It's not just included because everyone expected it to be there and to have more Joel in the game, though that is part of it. Well, think about what happens in those two storylines. Let's call the flashback storyline Plot A, and the revenge storyline Plot B. In Plot A, Ellie's mad at Joel, and in Plot B, Ellie is trying to get revenge against Abby. But let's expand that a little bit to the player's experience. In Plot A, Ellie is mad at Joel, and in Plot B, the player is trying to get revenge against Abby. But if Abby is a clone character of Joel, let's add that in. In Plot A, Ellie's mad at Joel, and in Plot B, the player is trying to get revenge against Joel's clone character. Are you starting to get a clearer picture now? Okay, so for those of you still maybe struggling, I'm just going to spell it out for you guys. The main storyline of the game, Abby killing Joel, Ellie trying to kill Abby, and everything in Seattle, is basically a metaphor for Ellie's inner feelings towards Joel in the flashbacks. Now, when I say it's a metaphor, I don't mean that everything in Seattle didn't happen and it was all in Ellie's head, but rather it's a way to get the player to feel the same emotions that Ellie was feeling towards Joel. Think about it this way. As we said before, Ellie felt that she needed to believe Joel's lie in order for her to live with all the loss and hardship that she faced. So when Ellie learns the truth about what Joel actually did, she feels almost betrayed by Joel. She becomes furious with him. So, like in most narrative fiction, the game wants us to feel the same hatred towards Joel that Ellie feels. But there's just one problem. We like Joel, and we played the first game from his perspective, so we empathize with him saving Ellie, even if Ellie doesn't. So, what do? Easy. You create a clone character of Joel and have the player hate that character. Both storylines follow the same basic arc. In the flashback storyline, Ellie first likes Joel, then Joel does something unforgivable to Ellie, lying to her, so she spends years hating him. Only that hatred drives them further apart and causes more harm to the both of them than good. But she eventually begins to understand why Joel did what he did and decides to try to forgive him. In the main storyline, assuming we haven't had the game spoiled for us, we start off the game liking Abby. Then Abby does something unforgivable to us. She kills Joel, so we begin hating her. Only the hate causes more harm to both us and her, and we eventually begin to understand why Abby did what she did. And in the end, we know that even if we want to kill Abby, we shouldn't. The game uses the revenge storyline to put the player on the exact same emotional wavelength as the protagonist Ellie. I've explained this to some people, and a common response I get is, oh, so Ellie projected her hate of Joel onto Abby? And like, kind of. I won't refute that, but I think you're missing the forest for the trees a bit. The point of the revenge storyline was about the player's experience, and having the player feel the same that Ellie was feeling. This is why Naughty Dog went in the direction that they went for the story. In a way, this storyline is actually the main plot of the game, and the revenge storyline is just a metaphor for the main plot. This brings us to the end of the game. Why does Ellie let Abby go, and what's with that flashback towards Joel? A lot of people who hate the game seem to think the subtext of this flashback is simply, well, Joel wouldn't want Ellie to do this. Which, like, sure, I can understand how one might reach that conclusion, but let's closely examine this scene. If that was all the subtext was, then Naughty Dog could have flashed towards virtually any moment with Joel. But look at the specific cutscene that they chose. It's this cutscene. Now, okay, what happens in that cutscene? Well, pay attention to what Ellie says.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
This is the moment where Ellie decides she wants to try to forgive Joel. This explains why Ellie lets Abby go. Essentially, this moment is the metaphor for this moment.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
This is where the main theme of the game comes into clearer focus. The main theme isn't revenge bad, but forgiving the unforgivable. Essentially, sometimes people we love will do things to us that are seemingly unforgivable, and it might be tempting to spend years loathing that person. But the game argues, doing so will only bring harm not just to them, but to others and even yourself. And that even though it may be difficult, even though you may not want to, you should try to learn to forgive the other person. This is what the ending of the game symbolizes. Throughout the game, the guitar minigame was a symbol of Ellie's connection to Joel. By continuing on her revenge mission against Abby, again a metaphor for hating Joel, she loses 2 of her fingers, and in the saddest minigame ever created, she finds in the last scene of the game that she can no longer play the guitar. Essentially, by continuing to hate Joel, she has permanently severed any connection she could have had with him. Part 5, Conclusion. Now, again, my goal with this video isn't to get you to like The Last of Us Part 2, but rather I hope that by now you understand better why Naughty Dog made all the narrative decisions that they made throughout the game. You don't have to necessarily like the direction that they went with the game or even think it's very good. While I spent most of this video defending the game against some of the most common criticisms lobbed against it, that doesn't mean there aren't valid reasons to hate the game. For example, I think a much more valid reason to hate the decision to kill off Joel the way that they did, much more valid than fan appreciation or logic, is the fact that by killing off Joel in such a brutal manner, the game essentially ruins what was a happy ending in part 1. There's just not really any joy in replaying the first game anymore now that we know what's going to happen to these characters in the next 4 years. And not only do I think that that's a much more valid reason to hate this plot point in part 2, and not only do I understand why this can be a sticking point for a lot of people, but I also think that that's the real underlying reason why people feel so strongly about hating this game, but maybe don't realize that's why. And while I do think the game is incredible, I also think that Neil Druckmann and the heads at Naughty Dog get more hate than they deserve for the game, at least for the wrong reasons. I find it frustrating that people hate them for the mere sin of making specific narrative choices, rather than the grueling amounts of hours in crunch time that they forced upon their employees for months before the game's release. Again, you don't have to like this game. There are plenty of reasons not to like it. But before you decide to hate it, I would hope that you at least take some time to understand it.